He had always such an energy. Even if he was old, he was in a way very healthy, very strong and powerful. And I remember my grandfather in that way, of someone who never quit, never had a desire to quit. And of course, being very afraid of death.
Do you think he was afraid of death or just resentful of death?
Maybe both. Maybe he was a Spaniard. And I think this representation of death surrounds him all his life.
This handsome 17th century building on the Rue des Grands Augustins in Paris is where Picasso had had a studio since 1937. It was here that he had painted Guernica, it was here that he spent the war years, and it was here that he gave what help he could to his friends in the resistance. Where better than here to start our story about Picasso's battles with his arch-enemy, death. The bars on this window in Picasso's Rue des Grands Augustins studio might as well have been the bars of a cell during the war. Picasso became more and more conscious of the German occupation, the claustrophobia, the curfew, above all the curfew, which meant that he had to get back by 10 o'clock at night, I think it was. And although he said later that he never actually painted the war was in everything he painted.
Les abords non vois-tu sont des choses légères et que l'on prend toujours beaucoup trop au sérieux. Lorsque tu m'as quitté, tu croyais bien mon cher me voir un jour très malheureuse.
In the first months of World War II, he did a series of paintings of sheep's heads, flailed, blood-drenched heads that he fed to his dogs. Grim, death-haunted images that would be his response to the horrors of Nazism.
Ce qui est assez surprenant, c'est que...
Isn't it surprising he stayed in Paris?
Tu sais, c'est pas le genre à vouloir sauver sa...
He wasn't the kind of man to worry about saving his skin. He cared more about the survival of his art. His artworks were his children, and all the children he had brought into the world since his childhood were stored in his studio. We could have gone to Mexico, we could have gone to New York, but we didn't. We stayed. And as you see, we're still alive.
I think we should believe him when he said that his staying in Paris during the occupation was not an act of courage, but rather a matter of apathy. And his family life was quite complicated. He still was in contact with Olga, who lived in France. He had a son with her, Paolo. He had a 5-year-old daughter at the beginning of the war with Marie-Thérèse, called Maya, and he saw them regularly, and he had his affair with Dora Maar. So to take all this world to America would have been difficult. But even if he had wanted to do that, I think one of the most important points is that he would not have wanted to leave his art behind.
Les abords non vois-tu sont des choses légères et que l'on prend toujours beaucoup trop au sérieux.
Most of his still lives are vanitases, allegorical references to death. Skulls on a bunch of leeks painted to look like crossbones. Another subject of the wartime pictures is the radiator. But the radiator was an allegory in reverse, because instead of representing heat, it represented cold, the chill of wartime, lack of fuel, because there's no way the radiator worked.
For me, this remains, even to this day, the most horrible time that one can live. I always felt that I would not be alive at the end of it. And also I have many, many friends who died in the underground. People who went through all that don't like to talk about it. If we talk about it, it seems it's exaggerate what we say, you know, but it's, we wouldn't even say 1/10 of what it was like.
Most days during the war, Picasso would come and eat here at Le Catalan, a Catalan restaurant, a few doors away from his studio on the Rue des Grands Augustins. And it was fairly black market, and Picasso ate reasonably well, but you can judge from the paintings he did of the place that food was very scarce, where you really get what food was like during the war. A bit of camembert in its box, a round of miserable-looking black sausage, an open drawer in which a lot of knives and forks are sort of falling out of it, and as Picasso said of it, they were souls in purgatory crying out for mercy. Although he usually came here with Dora Maar, who also lived round the corner, Rue de Savoie, the next street down, this is apparently where Picasso met François Gillot, who would take Dora's place. François Gillot was just 21, already a gifted and ambitious painter and a fan of Picasso's work. François was cool and self-assured, an ideal antidote to poor, tormented Dora Maar.
I started to paint very young, and I was 40 years younger than him, so I was at the beginning of my career. He was well established. It would have been perhaps more difficult if we had been the same age. I thought my work was in front of me, and a number of his works were behind him. And I did not compare myself to him. That would have been stupid. I have a certain amount of confidence in myself, and certainly if I didn't have confidence in myself, I would certainly not have dared to be with him. And plus, Picasso was not a man who would play peacock, you know. He was very accessible, and he took his work very seriously, but he could also joke about it, and it was not formidable. So all difficulties were set aside.
Picasso never told Dora, it's finished between us, because he didn't really want it to be finished. She knew that he was having a relationship with Françoise, but she couldn't believe that he would abandon her for a woman who was 40 years younger than he was. But that was a serious misjudgment on her part.
Picasso's art always reflects the circumstances of his life, and we can watch the deterioration of his relationship with Dora in the exceedingly troubling portraits of her. In 1945, she had a serious nervous collapse and underwent psychiatric treatment, which cured her mania but transformed this former atheist into a somewhat manic Catholic.
This was taken on a wonderful day for the French, the day Paris was liberated. Everyone celebrated, even the dog. You see the French flag? I still have it. Father painted it, because the Germans had taken all the flags. So, he painted a red, white and blue flag. And we had a flag in our living room. We were classy people, you know. And when the first American soldiers arrived in Paris, they made a beeline for our house.
When I came to Paris on my first furlough as a soldier, what I wanted to see more than anything else in the city, including the Eiffel Tower, was Pablo Picasso. And I was fortunate enough to find out where he lived, so I just went to his house and rang the bell. The studio was packed with paintings. I mean, there were hundreds, and drawings and things, all, you know, and he wasn't an orderly man, Picasso, at all. He had pictures thrown all over the floor, here and there.
And then we find the tomato plant on the radiator at the end of the wall. The tomato plant has big red tomatoes on it. The sun is shining, the window opens, the Americans have arrived, the British have arrived, and the mood of the workers changed totally. He's got a new girlfriend, and peace is at hand. Now that the darkness of war was well behind them, he and Françoise spent more and more time on the Côte d'Azur, where the town of Antibes had put the handsome, empty, but somewhat neglected Chateau Grimaldi at his disposal. He would fill it with art. For a few months, he came here every single day, and he painted and painted. And in the end, he was so happy here, so happy with what he'd done, happy with the way he'd expressed his joy at being back into the Mediterranean, that he decided that he would give everything in the building to the city of Antibes, and that's how it became this wonderful museum. I think this painting, more than any other, sums up Picasso's feelings of rejuvenation, his romance with Françoise, and his love affair with the Mediterranean. And you can feel that he feels relaxed, he feels happy, he's back in this classicistic world in which he grew up. I mean, here is Françoise dancing, here could be a caricature of himself, the pipe player, the centaur, the boat maybe going from Catalonia to Greece, who knows? And it emanates this wonderful feeling of joy.
Personally, when I see the Joie de Vivre, that's not at all my favorite painting of that period. I find it a little bit like a comic strip. God knows that a few years earlier he was not expressing the Joie de Vivre, he was expressing the drama of the Second World War. But then he felt renewed by contact with nature, and what he loved most in nature was the sea itself, even though he swam very badly. But he loved to be near the sea.
Virtually all the images, whether they're figures or whether they're still lifes, concern the sea. Always one's conscious of the sea. Here, for instance, is a sailor in a striped vest, such as Picasso also liked to wear. Here you have a marvelous still life which François Gillot believes was inspired by a Roman mosaic. You have the two octopuses, you have the conger eel, and then, of course, the sea urchin, which is a recurrent motif of nearly all these paintings. This painting over here, for instance, here is a woman holding these sea urchins, but typically Picasso has made a pictorial pun of a sexual nature. The sea urchin is placed as if it's a kind of vagina dentata, and the same with the wonderful painting of the owl on the back of a chair, where the owl seems to be a self-portrait. It's an anthropomorphic painting. And once again, the two sea urchins are on the seat of the chair, and they make a kind of casual pun on genitalia.
We had found a tiny owl who had a broken leg, and Picasso knew exactly how to repair the leg of that little animal. And since he didn't want to eat anything else, I had to go downstairs. There was a publisher, and there were a lot of mice there, so they would give me all the dead mice, that had been caught during the day, and then I would feed the owl with that, and he was very pleased. He didn't say thank you, but he was very pleased. There was at that time no canvases to be had in Antibes, so he had to paint on plywood boards. It was better to adopt a type of paint that could go on that type of support. On the way to the harbor, there was a shop where you could buy the type of paint with which you paint boats. And he said that one has to be very sturdy because it's served in the sea, which is salty. That's what I must paint with. And he bought a certain number of boxes of that paint, and there are some paintings which are really monumental, like the woman sitting where the legs. And then also a very large nude which is painted on it's not wood, it's cement board.
Picasso's Mediterranean happiness was enhanced by the birth of a son, Claude, in 1947, and a daughter called Paloma in 1949. The proud father was 68 when Paloma was born. I think the fact that Picasso hadn't had a child in his life for 30 years made a huge difference. And having these young children, being by the sea, this spirit is reflected in all the works of Françoise in that period.
Very much so. I mean, of all my memories of my father, there's such playfulness, and the playfulness was sometimes serious. I mean, playing was important to him. Playing was a serious act.
When Picasso's mistress or wife changed, he had always to find a new image for her. And with Françoise, it was La Femme Fleur, wasn't it?
Absolutely, completely. And the colors change. I mean, you get into blues and greens, a combination that you don't see before in that way. And then her body shapes also become very important. Her little bosom.
And she's also quite taller than the other
yes,
people.
very long neck.
Yes.
And I love all the drawings where you can see that the arches of her eyebrows, and then the beauty mark that she has is usually very prominent, but you see it more in the drawing than in the paintings. There are a few key things that he was fascinated with, but it's more about a mood, I think.
Well, it is me, but it doesn't necessarily look like me. When he did that, he wanted to find a kind of essence of what I am, but not the way I look. If I like it because it's a beautiful work of art, not because it's a portrait of me. That I don't care. If it's a portrait of somebody else, it would be just as beautiful or more, you know. I don't take it personally.
In 1948, Picasso moved to a small house hidden away on the outskirts of Vallauris, a town a few miles inland from Cannes. Vallauris had been a pottery town since Roman times. Over the years, it had become the Sèvres of schlock. However, Picasso's ceramics would re-establish the place's prestige. Haven't been here for 50 years, but my God, it's changed a lot. This is the house, La Galloise, the Welsh house that Picasso bought because it was very, very difficult to find. It's in a tangle of little back streets. He also chose it because in this building here lived a man, live here, Picasso is no good as a painter, go away. She was a teacher of dancing, of free dancing, and occasionally in the bushes here you'd see middle-aged women dressed as nymphs cavorting around. And you then ran the gauntlet of all this, and there, over there, you would find the villa where he lived with Françoise.
I think that after the horrors of Second World War, the desire to live as simply as possible was in many people's mind, and in mine as well as his. I don't think it had anything political about it. It was just like a reminder that nothing else was really necessary.
Picasso decided to become a communist shortly after the end of the war in Europe. I later asked Jacqueline, his second wife, why? He was against war, against want, against fascism, she said. What was he for, I asked. She wasn't sure. However, he remained a not very ardent party member for the rest of his life.
When Picasso paints, the art world sits up and begs, so he can afford wild goose chases.
What the communists needed from Picasso was his prestige, and one of their most important non-militaristic weapons in the Cold War was a peace movement. It had tremendous power and importance at the time, and Picasso was their main peace warrior. He was very, very important. Picasso traveled for the Communist Party for the different peace congresses quite a bit. He went to Poland, to Sheffield in England.
Je suis venu pour la deuxième fois en Angleterre et c'est pour le congrès de la paix que je suis venu. J'espère que ça va être...
They wanted him to participate in organizations that were defending their cause, and they needed a poster. They found among a stack of lithographs the famous dove, which actually had been a lithograph of a pigeon, and said, this is our peace dove. And this became, of course, Picasso's most famous contribution to the fight.
And then wasn't there a question of his going to America?
Yes, he had actually applied for a visa. He was supposed to go with a group, but the real problem for the Americans was Picasso's presence in the group. J. Edgar Hoover had started a file on Picasso for the FBI in January 45 already. And he had started the file. Yeah, look at this. And he had started the file actually with the idea that one day Picasso may ask for a visa and that it should be refused. They would, for example, intercept telegrams. Here's an incoming telegram from Moscow to Picasso. A big part of this document was sent to me blacked out by the FBI because they still consider part of this information to be secret and not available.
This is the terrace of La Gauloise. Simple terrace, simple house, and inside very simple rooms which were filled with odd bits of furniture Picasso and Françoise had bought, and they lived like good Communist Party members. There was a maid, but there was absolutely no luxury or comfort or fancifulness at all. There were always toys all over the floor, evidence of the two children. Picasso didn't paint here. He worked at Le Fournace, which is a factory he'd bought, an old perfume distillery, which is in the main part of Valeries. And when one arrived here, at least when I arrived here, he'd whisk you off as soon as possible down to Le Fournace. Polo, the son, would drive the car, and there you'd see these amazing ceramics and new paintings and stuff that he was always delighted to show his friends. This was made in 1950, so you must have been one.
Exactly, so it was more a projection of me than a true portrait of me. But yet I always associated with it because everybody told me it was me, so.
And it even looks a little bit like you, I think.
Yes.
Now, what are these various elements?
So we have a basket here, and then some pieces of flat wire that go around here and all around there. And then we've got some shoes. So apparently those shoes I think he found on walking down from the house to the Fournace, to the studio.
And I think he'd always wanted to do a piece of sculpture which was off the ground,
right,
which seemed impossible. And this was the solution.
It's really quite
amazing,
miraculous how it stands.
People always seem to think that art should not be fun. I mean, this is completely ridiculous, of course. And my father thought that his art was quite serious, but some of the things that happened while he was doing it were fun for him because he discovered things that, you know, he did not even know were in him. So that's quite a giggle in a way. And it's not just for giggles, but to tickle the mind, to make you see something that you would not see otherwise.
This one does seem to have a kind of magical aspect to it. Now, it's made up of, it's the big basket, isn't it?
Yes. Then those are the fronds from the palm trees, both here and in the face. That's natural shape. And then obviously some wood pieces.
And then some pottery, the udder.
Yeah, but you have to come around and see it. I mean, I don't know, you know, where they came from. Except that they were obviously from Valeries, but I don't know how those shapes came to be. But it's actually also very realistic at the same time.
And then there are two other little bits there. The anus is a tube which Picasso at one moment was going to put a whistle like you get in toys and stick it in it, so like when you squeeze they whistle.
Right.
One of the reasons Picasso enjoyed being back in the south of France was the excellent bullfights to be seen at Arles and Nîmes and nearby at Fréjus. He seldom missed a corrida or the dinners afterwards which we used to arrange for him and the bullfighters. Picasso's father, Don José, was a great aficionado. He had a passion for bulls, and he took little Pablo to the bull ring from his earliest years. Pablo is a bullfighter at heart. Luis Miguel Dominguin, the great bullfighter, said, "The bulls are in his soul." And another friend said, "Let's face it, the bull ring is Pablo's home." And I think this all explains his extraordinary identification with the bull, with the bullfighter, and also the identification of the women in his life with the poor old horses that the picadors have had a go at.
The bullfight, of course, is a metaphor for a struggle and death. It's a beautiful way of dying. It's a beautiful way of killing. The bull is both a male opponent, because it's very masculine, and a woman that is penetrated at the end by the sword after this beautiful dance in which it's tormented and controlled and dominated by the bullfighter. So I think that these things clearly appealed to Picasso.
Everyone thinks they know Picasso. Everyone knows a part, which is fine. And everyone has their favorite part, or section, or period, or this or that. So everyone feels comfortable with Picasso, and everyone owns Picasso. But in fact, he's always somewhere else, where you don't expect him. So there's always another, niche. This is why we put on this show, is that we showed something that everyone thought, oh, it's just a ceramic thing, and blah, blah, blah. Just crafts, But in fact, it's completely different. It's another world. It's a very, very complete, complex body of his work, and it's a big surprise. This piece is very interesting because it's a piece that was designed by Madame Ramy of the Madura factory, and you see it's just a tripod, sort of a modern design. But my father got a hold of it, and he saw something completely different in it. He thought, well, what is this, and he had the idea to make it a portrait of my mother holding her head like this in her hands. But it's two ways. You have to come see the other side. It has the same thing, and you can also see her breast. And it's very interesting to find this solution.
The ceramics are in many ways the Francoise period of Picasso's life, and because people haven't known them, they haven't seen his response to her in the way he did in this work. The work behind me is a piece of kiln furniture, which is a typical thing of Picasso to select. That is, it's an ordinary piece of ceramic that had been used to support other ceramics in the kiln. It had undergone many firings, and he turned it into not only a portrait of her, a recognizable portrait of her, but something that has an echo of a kind of ancient funerary monument. So he mixes her presence with an ancient tradition.
The Mediterranean was the center of culture in antiquity, and his background, as everyone's background in Europe, in our culture, is really based on Greco-Roman antiquity. And it's interesting for him to see and compare himself to the great masters, or even the unknown masters of history. And he was very amused that maybe one day those shards, those bits and pieces of pots, broken pots that he had decorated, would be found, again in some sort of archaeological situation, and people would have to figure out which one of the old Greek painters had painted these things.
Picasso was amazingly generous to the city of Vallauris. He gave this wonderful sculpture, The Man with the Sheep, which he regarded as perhaps his masterpiece. He liked the idea of having it as a public monument, which people could relate to in very different ways. Or he said it's not Christian, but people do relate to it as a Christian symbol. Some people relate to it as a classical image of today. Other people think of it as a symbol of a working man's life. In 1950, Picasso was made an honorary citizen of Vallauris, and in response to this, he agreed to decorate a Romanesque chapel which had been part of the chateau. And he finished in 1951 these two great panels of war and peace. The panel on the left here is peace, and it's far and away the more successful of the two. And here I think we should remember that Picasso had always been a pacifist, and so one feels that his heart is very much in this panel. We have people dancing, the sea in the background. We have this beautiful image in the center of Claude, his son, ploughing the sea with Pegasus, François suckling the newborn Paloma, and it is a beautiful ensemble. Here, on the right, is war, and there are some marvelous bits in it. But Picasso, who's usually so good at depicting violence, we only have to think of Guernica, I think hasn't really brought it off. There's something very corny about these black, gigantic figures stabbing each other. This symbolism doesn't work for me, and I don't think that it's anything like as great as the peace panel. At the end is this later panel, which I think is one of the worst paintings he ever did. It's about all the races of the world paying tribute to the dove of peace, but it seems to me very banal indeed. At the time he was painting the central panel, he was at work on the massacre in Korea, which is an overt piece of agitprop. It shows a group of women and children being massacred by a lot of evil people with machine guns, and it just doesn't work at all. And I think after that Picasso realized that although he would remain a member of the Communist Party, indeed was a very good and obedient member of the Communist Party, he would give up painting on the communist line. By 1953, Picasso's relationship with François Gillot had begun to unravel. He looked around for a new companion. There were many eager candidates.
He saw us sitting, smoking and having a coffee. And he came over the wall, and as he was very small, we couldn't see him. We only saw that picture, this one, come over the wall. And we knew it was an invitation to his studio. And we knew it was me, because nobody else had a ponytail like this. So we rushed in, and he started talking to us and asking me if I would sit for him. Then another day he would make me visit his studio. We went upstairs where he had a little room with a bed and a chair, and then he would jump on the bed, and I stayed at the door thinking, wow, am I meant to jump on the bed too? But I was terrified that it, you know, I think he was trying to find out what I would do. He was 73 and I was 19. So now I'm getting nearer to his age. I keep thinking, what was he looking for in me? I was a relief for him, perhaps. And I was there like a new life, you know, a new story.
When it was over, it was over. You know, a relationship has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I still like him as an artist, but as a person, it was over. It had run its course. Once I turned my head in a different direction, that's it.
François Gillot finally walked out on Picasso in the summer of 1953. He was desperately lonely. Sylvette David was just a model. She wasn't a mistress. He had 2, if not 3 other girlfriends, but he couldn't make up his mind. One of the women was Jacqueline Roch, the wife of a colonial official who'd got bored to death living in Africa and had come to work in Valoris.
I think it was the year Françoise left. Jacqueline Hutin came to the shop, perhaps to buy something, and we got on well together. I was expecting my second baby. I was no longer working in the factory. I was in the shop. Who will replace you? I spoke to my parents-in-law, and when I had to stop working, Jacqueline replaced me. Jacqueline was a charming girl, very intelligent, nice, very much a woman.
Très agréable, très femme.
Très femme, en effet, oui.
After the birth of my baby, I came back to the pottery, and Jacqueline stopped working there.
Jacqueline, oui, a cessé son travail.
After that, I don't know.
Après, je ne sais plus.
As I said before, we weren't in on the secret of their relationship.
De leur relation.
I came into Picasso's life around this time, and I saw a great deal of Jacqueline. She was extremely pretty. She was the same height as Picasso. That was always rather important. He was so short. And indeed, she could have been his daughter. She had great big eyes like him. And as always, when Picasso had a new mistress, he developed a new image for her. Picasso had always loved the paintings of Delacroix, particularly his famous painting, The Women of Algiers. And it transpired that Jacqueline was the double of one of the women in this famous painting in the Louvre. And the early images of her are of this rather exotic, slightly orientalist figure. And Jacqueline, who didn't have a particularly long neck, she had a rather short neck, ends up with a long neck and with a totally different allure, which she gradually came to adopt in herself. Jacqueline's slightly orientalist image was very appropriate to the new house Picasso had just bought. The Villa La Californie was a great big turn-of-the-century villa in execrable taste, but rather glamorous and exotic. I became a regular visitor. Picasso turned out to be tremendously house-proud. He loved having people to see his grand new residence. All his old friends, they would all come and see him. He would clown a bit. There would be Indian feathered headdresses. There would be bowler hats. And Picasso loved all this. Because what people don't realize about Picasso was his enormous charm, his geniality, and his generosity. Towards the end of his life, Picasso tried to cannibalize the art of the past. He took one great artist after another, and he took their art and Picassified it. There's no other way to describe it. And he was quite systematic in these cannibalistic feasts. In the summer of 1957, I went to see Picasso, and Jacqueline told me that he was upstairs. He was in a very, very bad mood because he'd taken on Velázquez. Like Jacob wrestling with the angel, he decided to take on the greatest Spanish master of all. We could hear him thundering around upstairs. He'd set aside a special room for this, next door to where he kept his pigeons. And you could hear him stamping around, you could hear things falling over. And Jacqueline said, "L'abominable homme des neiges," the abominable snowman is at it again. And occasionally he'd come down in a vile temper. And this went on for months. When Picasso first saw this great painting, it was shortly after the death of his sister Conchita. He was 14 years old, and his father had brought him to the Prado to see these masterpieces for the first time. He was fascinated by the figure of the little princess, the little infanta, in the center, who is the same age, roughly, as Conchita. And he's concentrated a great many of the studies on her. Among his variations, 40 variations of the subject, there is one of a little boy playing a piano. And I said, what relevance does this have to the Velázquez? And he said, you don't get it? He said, and of course this is the gesture that the lady-in-waiting is making to the Infanta. In fact, she's offering her some water. But it looks exactly like someone playing the piano. With high-rise buildings going up all over Cannes, Picasso began to feel that his villa, the California, was being overlooked. He needed privacy. He always wanted privacy. And so he looked around for an alternative, and he found this great chateau here, the Chateau de Vauvenargues. Douglas Cooper and I were the first guests, and Jacqueline photographed us on the steps of the chateau. And then he took us around and showed us everything, including a great big gun he'd bought, because the chateau included a great slab of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire, and it had a lot of game, and he proposed to do some shooting. Of course, he never did. He used to boast that he was a very good shot and used to go to fairgrounds and win prizes, but Jacqueline discouraged him from taking the gun out. Of course, the first question we asked Picasso was, what was he going to do about the Mont Sainte-Victoire, which had been Cézanne's favourite motif? And he shrugged his shoulders and said, just wait and see. And we waited and waited, and finally he found a solution. He saw the Montagne Sainte-Victoire in the terms of Jacqueline. It's like a great recumbent figure with a pine tree on one side, now in the Art Institute, Chicago. And that was his Montagne Sainte-Victoire. François Gillot used to complain that Picasso had a way of setting his women up on a plinth and finding a wonderful image for them and then shoving them off onto the floor and using them like a doormat. Here we have a perfect example of this. Here is Jacqueline pissing on the beach. What could be a more degrading image than that? And yet it's painted in such a lively way, and the image is so gay and full of light and fun that somehow it's not vulgar, it doesn't make us feel uncomfortable. And I think he borrowed this image from Rembrandt. The Rembrandt in the National Gallery in London, where the woman is holding up her shift and evidently was at one moment pissing into the stream. And I know it was a painting by Rembrandt that Picasso particularly liked. In 1961, Picasso finally married Jacqueline, with whom he'd been living since 1954. And they looked for the most secluded property they could find. And they moved to this beautiful Notre-Dame-de-Vie, named after this pilgrimage church. The gates to Notre-Dame-de-Vie were usually barred to everybody. Picasso wanted to work. He wanted to spend his last years in isolation, working, working, working. Jacqueline was told to keep people out, even members of the family. This extraordinary property could be easily fortified against the world. It had ramparts, it had a canal, and I think there was another aspect to the property that appealed to Jacqueline. The name of this church, Notre-Dame-de-Vie. She saw herself as Notre-Dame-de-Vie, Our Lady of Life. She saw herself as Picasso's savior at the end of his life. She identified with the church and with the property. And after his death, she stayed on here until she ultimately killed herself. Before he died, Picasso endeavored to cannibalize as much as he could of European art. He sent for slides of old and not-so-old masters and had Jacqueline project them on one of the studio walls. And they would all spend evenings dissecting Rembrandt's Night Watch or Van Gogh's self-portrait in a straw hat. Rembrandt inspired a whole new cast of characters, cavaliers and musketeers. And the Van Gogh self-portrait inspired some of Picasso's self-portraits.
I remember well my father and I going almost every month to Notre-Dame-de-Vie to visit him until very close before he died. It was quite usual to go to southern France from Paris, driving with my father to see my grandfather. And I just remember a serious matter always. The only weapon he got was his art, and he went very, very strongly until the last day of his life.
And one feels sometimes those last works are a kind of race against death. I mean, he's pitting himself against death, in a way.
Yeah, but maybe at that time he had not any more sexual activity, so that was already death, you know.
Sometime in his 80s, Picasso discovered to his horror that he was impotent. But typically, he put his impotence to good use. This desperate, self-referential, I mean, it's a Picasso with his enormous eyes, looking absolutely miserable, and there's no joy in the younger woman, who is evidently Jacqueline. And I find it one of the most moving of the late images because it sums up the feelings of a very old man who is impotent, who loves his wife, but is incapable really of doing very much about it. I think it's one of his saddest pictures. Eros and Thanatos, love and death, had always been intertwined in Picasso's work, and never more than at the end of his life, when death cast its shadow over everything he did. When he was well into his 80s, he devoted a wonderful series of engravings to the subject of La Celestina, the famous procuress of Spanish fiction. Celestina was a spreader of syphilis. Picasso also told me, when he was young, the town crier who went around announcing people's deaths was always an old woman, like the Celestina. Picasso continued to work right up to the end. He died aged 91 on April the 8th, 1973. In the last few years of his life, Picasso didn't come here all that much, but he loved the place, and this is where he's buried. And he chose to be buried underneath one of his most beautiful sculptures, the woman holding a vase. The funeral was a very unfortunate and unhappy event. Jacqueline wouldn't allow his children and some of his grandchildren to come, and so they gathered here, and they had to watch the funeral from afar. And then in 1986, it was Jacqueline's turn to die. And I came to the funeral. It was the last time I was here, and it was an unbelievably moving occasion. We watched the woman with the vase, this great big sculpture, being pushed back over the grave. And as I looked back, I thought that the woman with the vase had somehow turned into the woman with the lamp, and the woman with the lamp was Jacqueline, for Picasso, his Notre-Dame-de-Vie.